All right. Welcome, everyone. Today's presentation is titled Responding to Rebellion, and it's from George Washington's Mount Vernon, Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, and the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. And this is part of the Presidential Primary Sources Project. So the Presidential Primary Sources Project is a partnership between Internet 2, the National Archives, and the National Park Service. And it is a free educational program we put on from January through April. And this is just a reminder that by participating in the webinar, you agreed to be recorded, streamed, broadcasted, and archived as part of the program series. And we do have copies of all of our presentations on YouTube, so you can go to our YouTube channel and find all of our past presentations from the years, and also find other presentations from the future as they're put on. And once again, we're so excited to have you all here today. It looks like we got a great group so far, and we'd like you to all participate as much as possible. The main way we're going to use participation tools is through the chat box. So that's a little chat bubble at the bottom of your screen. And with that, we just want to make sure we keep all of our comments on topic and relevant to what the presenters are talking about. And I will also note that if you're in a larger classroom, it might help to have someone kind of type out stuff to put in the chat for you. Another way we're going to use participation tools is by, if you'd like to be on camera, you can just put something in the chat and I can promote you to a panelist and you can turn your camera on. You can kind of wave to us if you would like. And another way that we like to keep people participating is using the rename feature. So if you could rename yourself to something you'd like to be called by, that way we know that when we're calling on you that it's something you'd like to be called. And if you need help with that, you can also drop that in the chat and I can help rename you as well. Thanks again for joining us. And here's our website if you would like to find future programs or our past program archive. Everything's at that link right there. And with that, I will turn it over to our presenters.
Hello, my name is Heather Nice, and I am the Director of Education at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum. I am not actually one of your presenters today. I am taking the role of moderator. So I'm going to stop for just a second before I tell you more and ask each one of our wonderful presenters to introduce themselves and their president in order.
Well, if we're going in order, Heather, then I'll go first. Hi, everybody. My name is Allison Wickens. I'm at George Washington's Mount Vernon, and the president I will be speaking about today is George Washington, the first president of the United States.
Hi, everyone. I am Erin Adams, and I am coming from Nashville, Tennessee, where we tell the story of Andrew Jackson, the seventh president of the United States.
And I'm Christian McWhorter. I'm the Lincoln historian at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum, and I'll be talking about the 16th president of the United States. And it's a real thrill to work with all these other presidential sites today.
So as you can imagine, with three presidents to talk about, we have a lot today. And so each president is going to spend about 15 minutes telling you information, and then we're going to have time for Q&A at the end. What we'd like to do is if you have questions, please type them in the chat box. I will watch those. And if there's one that looks like I can ask it right as someone's presenting, I'll ask it then. If not, we'll merge them at the end. And as Casey mentioned, if you'd like to actually have your camera turned on, if you'll just make note of that by your question, if we pick it to ask, then we'll definitely call on you to ask that question. As Casey also mentioned, we are using the chat feature, so I wanted to do a quick practice. So if you would, talk to the person sitting next to you, or if you have your own computer, use the chat box, if you would. Take about 30 seconds, and what I'd like you to do is define what you think a rebellion is, because as you know, today's topic is responding to rebellion. So if you could really quickly write in the chat box what you think a rebellion is, we'll look at those and then we'll get started. So we've got mutiny, uprising against the government, violence. Any other ideas? Resisting against someone or something. So I'm definitely seeing kind of a spectrum of power dynamics here. Overthrowing power. Any other answers before we go? Get one more second. Wow, David. Anti-disestablishmentarianism. We've got some great answers flowing in, so be sure you watch the chat box to see what your peers are saying. And Allison, I am going to turn my camera off and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Heather. It's so great to be here with everybody today. And I'm really excited to be exploring this idea of responding to rebellion, not only with my fellow peers at these other institutions, but with you guys in the classroom. I'm going to be talking about the Whiskey Rebellion. And I want to start just by explaining a little bit about the history around that before I talk specifically about Washington's decisions in response to that. Because I think historical context for these events are important. So it's the 18th century, it's a new nation. George Washington is president. And together he is trying to figure out how to govern. He's setting precedents right now, sort of like what this government looks like when it's in action. And one of the things that he's exploring is how to ensure that the government has enough money to pay for what it needs to do. And so with the assistance of the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, he establishes an excise tax. And this is a federal tax on anybody, regardless of what state they live in, on specific goods and services. And the rebellion comes about because this excise tax is applied to whiskey. And whiskey, so that anybody who is selling whiskey has to make sure that they sell it high enough to give some money of that whiskey sales back to the government, the federal government specifically. So before the United States was formed, when it was the Articles of Confederation, states would tax, but the central government wouldn't tax in this way. So the farmers who were making this whiskey, they rebelled against paying this tax. Farmers in Western Pennsylvania, which is where the rebellion happened, they grew wheat, and the easiest way for them to move their wheat to market was actually to distill it and turn it into whiskey. And so it was a much less risky venture to bring whiskey in barrels over the mountains to Philadelphia to sell than it was to move all of that wheat. And they could sell it for as much or more if they brought it across in whiskey form. And so it was really a best business sense for them to do that. And they were frustrated because if they brought their wheat all the way to Philadelphia to sell, it wouldn't have this tax on it. But if they brought their whiskey to Philadelphia to sell, which was safer and less risky to move, they would be taxed for it. And they just didn't think that was fair. They felt that it was, it gave more preference to the people in Philadelphia, the farmers out east, than it did out west. It was a real objection to that. So they protested against it. They refused to pay those taxes. And so as we explore this idea, we see what's worthy of protesting the government for. And these farmers, Western farmers in Pennsylvania said, we don't want to have this tax. And then the real critical thing, and why this is covered in so many civics classes and history classes today, this Whiskey Rebellion, is that this is a chance for George Washington and the state of Pennsylvania and these individual farmers to figure out who has the authority to tax and who has the authority to decide what taxes can be paid. And so we see a real nice opportunity to see the federal government stretching its muscles and saying, I don't care what the states think, I don't care what these individual farmers think. The most important thing is for the government to pay, for individuals to pay this government tax. So we have three different actors. I've referenced them in this conversation already. We have the protesters, the people rebelling themselves, the farmers in Western Pennsylvania saying, we're making this whiskey, we're selling this whiskey, we are not paying tax on this whiskey. We have the President George Washington and his cabinet, like Alexander Hamilton I mentioned, that are responsible for making sure the federal government can operate and has funds to operate. And then we have the Pennsylvania state officials. Thomas Mifflin is the governor of Pennsylvania. And he's sort of in the middle of this. He wants to make sure that he's a good state in the federal system, but he also wants to care for the people in his state, make sure their rights are not infringed upon. So we have those three actors. Now let's explore a little bit of the primary source that we want to be looking at today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. If you guys wait just a minute. Oh, let's see. I don't have that opportunity to share my screen. Is that something that we can change, Chris? Kate?
Yeah, you should be good now. I just changed it.
Thank you, Casey. All right. So to respond to this rebellion, George Washington on September 25th, 1794, issues a proclamation. I wanted to share it in this presentation as it looked in the 18th century. And on my screen, you can see the newspaper in which it was printed on. It was printed in newspapers all over the country, this proclamation in response to this whiskey rebellion. And we have it issued in September 25th, 1794, by the presidents of the United States of America, a proclamation. And you can see I've sort of highlighted or zoomed in on the top of the document here. So you have the presidential seal. It's very official. And it's spread throughout the young nation in this format of newspapers where lots of people can read it, or if they can't read themselves, can have it read to them by someone who is literate in their community. And it is with the authority that this is the bottom of the document here, in testimony whereof I have caused the seal of the United States of America to be affixed to these presents and signed the same with my hand. So this is a very official document. The president has signed it. It's under president's seal. And this is the proclamation that Washington says in response to the rebellion. I wanted to, like I said, take a look at the primary source, but I won't make us read it in that format. A little bit about 18th century documents. So this is the text of that format. And a little bit about Washington in the 18th century. 18th century is always a little bit hard to read. Sometimes the font's a little different or the handwriting's a little hard. But also George Washington, when he was writing, wrote in a confusing, often obtuse manner. So sometimes it's hard to figure out what he's read. Your English teachers would probably not give George Washington good writing grades. I highlighted these 4 words in this whole long paragraph. This is that paragraph. These are the 4 times Washington uses a period. This is lots and lots of big, long sentences. But we want to figure out what he did. What does Washington do with this proclamation? So I'm going to break down a couple areas of this document so we can help figure out how he responded to it. And the first thing you should know about George Washington, as illustrated in this print of him during the same time period, is that Washington thought of himself as the center of the United States. So each one of these circles on the outside represents a different state, and each state has its own interests and its own responsibilities. And the thing that connects them all these states, is the president, the United States, the central federal government, the person who is responsible not just for one state and one state's interests, but for all the states and all the states' interests. And that's hard to do because every state is interested in something different. And even like within Philadelphia, Western Pennsylvania and Eastern Pennsylvania want different things. But Washington is making every decision based on the whole of the United States. And we see that in this document. So right now, this is the same document we saw before, but just broken down with this sentence highlighted. Washington says, the contest being the issue at hand, what this proclamation is about, whether a small portion of the United States shall dictate to the whole Union at the expense of those who desire peace. So if you have a small part of the country that is rebelling, that is causing violence, that is resisting taxes through violent means, you can't let that group determine the path of the whole Union. Again, Washington's thinking about the whole Union, and he can't just respond to violent threats based on one specific experience in one part of one state. And so this is clearly what he's thinking about and why he needs to respond to this rebellion. And let me be clear, this rebellion has lasted 3 years. It started in 1791, first as a peaceful response and a choice not to pay, but by 1794, it has grown violent. And there are opportunities specifically to rebel or to call upon these individuals as treasonous in the way that they're reacting. So as we see at the top of the screen here, Washington says, I thought it sufficient in the first instance, rather than taking measures for calling for the militia, rather than calling out the army to fight, or the state militias, excuse me. But I didn't want to do that at first. And then he says, but the moment is now come. So as much as he wanted to not call the militia after 3 years, and now it's becoming violent, he now needs to call in the militia when every form of conciliation has been here. He's tried every form of conciliation. And what follows are lots and lots of examples of the conciliation that he has tried over the last 3 years. And then in the next highlighted section here, you see him say that he hereby declares and makes known that a force of militia, and he lists the states in which the state militias are coming from: New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, that a force is already in motion to the scene of disaffection. Disaffection meaning the opposite of affection. So these are the rebellion that is not fond of the federal government's policies. And this force that is already in motion shall meet full succor under the standard or under the flag to those who have been offended against the law. So he is saying here that there are troops, and in fact, troops that he is leading. This is a work of art from the time period that hangs at the Met now, that are going to Western Pennsylvania to make sure that this rebellion is put down. And so his choice as the president of the United States, and in fact, he is the only president to ever lead a military force while in office. There he is on his horse, Blueskin, as he's moving through the nation. And then, of course, because he's moving these troops while this article is being printed in the newspaper, the rebellion actually calms down and breaks up before the forces ever reach that part of Pennsylvania. It's the threat of the military response that stops the rebellion. Washington isn't just concerned with stopping the rebellion itself. At the end of this proclamation, it's not just to those individuals that were doing these treasonous acts. He says at the end, I exhort all individuals, officers, and bodies of men to contemplate with abhorrence to the measures, to really see how horrible, abhorrence is horrible, that the measures were that led directly or indirectly to the crimes which produce the military response. Because it really got to see how hard it was for the military and how bad things needed to be for the military to respond in this way. He didn't move these troops with any light or caution. And he says the reason why he did is that in an Enlightenment age, or an age when people can use reason over passion to make decisions, that they are able to elect their own government. With the gratitude of being able to elect your own government, it's a blessing, but it does mean you have to follow the laws and the Constitution. So the ability to participate in this government, this blessing of self-governance, does come with the responsibility of following its laws and paying the taxes that those laws have enacted. And so the opportunity for us to, and I'll stop sharing my screen now. The opportunity for us to be able to explore this document and see sort of Washington's reasoning, not only for sending in troops in response to this rebellion, but very specifically have the opportunity to show other citizens who weren't rebelling at that point in time why he sent those troops out. I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Jackson in just a second, but in concluding remarks, I just wanted to comment that this, although ended the rebellion, it really started the political debates that informed the rest of Washington's presidency, really dividing this idea of the federal government's over a stretch of power versus the states' rights to be able to freely reject those federal laws. And Washington mainly wanted to make sure the federal government maintained its authority and that no small part of any state could derail what was important for all states involved. So happy to discuss that more as we delve into other presidents' responses to rebellion. But just a short note, and I know Heather will help me in the chat here. If you think you would have decided something different than George Washington, you can play our game, Be Washington. The Whiskey Rebellion is one of the 4 scenarios you can play and be able to make your own decision about how to respond to the Whiskey Rebellion. All right, I'm turning it over to Andrew Jackson. Erin, are you with us, Ms. Adams?
Hi, I am. So welcome. I really wish I had a B. Jackson version of the nullification crisis, because that would have made this a lot more fun to learn. But the story of the nullification crisis is Andrew Jackson's approach to responding to rebellion. So when you think about our 7th president of the United States, his presidency is happening almost 40 years after Washington's presidency. So in 40 years of being a nation, you know, George Washington and those first couple of presidents have got to tackle some of those very early growing pains of the nation. Do we mean what we say in the Constitution? How do we balance the needs of the states, the federal governments, the needs of individual citizens over groups of citizens, over representative bodies? Those issues are all in process, right? But even almost 40 years later, when Jackson is president, we're still dealing with some of those very same issues. And like the Whiskey Rebellion, this is going to come down to taxes. If you want people to get upset real quick over something, whether it makes sense or not, deal with their money, right? So the issue of taxes, the idea that we agree as citizens, part of our agreement with one another is that the nation has expenses and we all chip in on how those get met, okay? But like with the Whiskey Rebellion, there began to be some taxation policies developed by other presidents in the interim that began to have an unequal impact on the states of the South, especially the state of South Carolina. So Andrew Jackson, president from 1829 until 1837. And when he comes into office, there was already a series of protective taxes that we call tariffs. And tariffs were meant to be a protective device that could be used to promote American economy. So in other words, you may hear a lot the government talk about, oh, we should buy American. Don't buy foreign-made goods, buy American-made goods. Then you keep American businesses in operation. You keep American citizens employed. All the tax money that we spend on them, it stays within our nation. And perhaps our costs may be lower because we're not paying things like import and export taxes. We're not paying things like international, shipping and regulations and so the idea being that we protect the American economy if we focus on using American products. Okay, so this is the idea. And this is the idea that is informing these tariffs. And yet the rate of taxation is so high on these tariffs that it begins to get a nickname, the tariff of abominations. Throw this in the chat if you like, just because I like seeing your responses. But if you were to hear of a tax today passed called the tariff of abominations, how are you feeling about this tariff from the very beginning? All right, abomination is not a great word. This is not a compliment for anything. So how are we feeling about a tariff of abominations? Webster County Middle School, looks like some of you said it's going to be bad. It's a little scary. Maybe we're a little uncertain of how this is going to go. Maybe this is going to end up taking more money than we think that it might, going forward. We don't want to pay it. Absolutely. So already, the tariff of abominations is got everybody's radars up. This might be something that we don't want to have to endure for very long. I want to show you one picture, though, so you begin to get an idea of what this means for the various parts of the United States. And we're going to look at this very quickly. So let me enlarge my image just real quick. Okay, so when you look at this map of the United States, you can see we're no longer just the 13 colonies on the East Coast, right? We have expanded. Louisiana Territory has been purchased. The nation goes beyond the Mississippi River at this point. So give me an idea of how the businesses of our nation are divided. Can you tell from this map? Throw it in the chat. You know, are we a nation of farmers? Are we a nation of factories? Is part of the nation dedicated to factories and part of the nation is dedicated to agriculture and farming? What are your observations? Oh, Mindy Terry, you had said resentful about the terrible abominations. I think that's an excellent way to describe what's happening. All right, thank you, Webster County. So the North is very industrial. The South is much more agrarian or agriculturally based. That's what we mean by that word. You're absolutely right. So what this tariff begins to do is essentially create an imbalance in taxes. The South is putting out so much cotton, especially cotton, but so much cotton, so much corn and wheat and other products. And because of the size of the region and because of how far farmers have to send their goods to get them to market, the city of Charleston, South Carolina, ends up becoming the major American port for the southern United States, even more than New Orleans during this time, which is a little surprising. And based on the way the tariff was calculated, that tax, the people who are doing the exporting of American goods are now paying taxes on those exports, because the idea is they're trying to keep that material here and yet they're sending it abroad. So by 1832, the year that this rebellion happens, the state of South Carolina is essentially paying 2/3 of the nation's entire tax bill. All right, so think about all of the taxes that are required to run the United States, and the state of South Carolina is covering 2/3 of that total figure. All right, like most people of the time, you're probably thinking that doesn't sound fair. That's not sustainable. We can't keep that up. The state of South Carolina cannot keep that up. And this is exactly the argument that South Carolina takes back to the federal government. Look, you got to give us some help here. We cannot do this on our own. That these taxes are breaking our businesses. We're not going to be able to keep up with the production that we've been making if these taxes are going to take so much out of us. Okay, so this is the issue. Now, with the Whiskey Rebellion, this issue becomes whether or not people can be taxed and how committed the federal government is to making sure that people pay their taxes. This now is kind of on the next scale up. You've got an entire state of the union who's now going back to the federal government to say, look, we can't do this. And if you don't give us some help, we won't do it. All right. So South Carolinians, and the federal government, I should say, enforces the payment of taxes. That's the precedent that was set in the Whiskey Rebellion. This is what they're going to keep doing. And South Carolina finally sits down to articulate its position. And I'm going to go ahead and stop that share real quick. And what the state of South Carolina suggests is that there comes a time when if the demands of the federal government on the state government are too burdensome, and the federal government will not help the state come to a more fair solution or a more fair arrangement, then the state has the right to refuse to follow or enforce federal laws. This is what we call nullification. So the idea was that if the federal government will either not renegotiate the taxes that South Carolina is paying, or if the federal government will not provide South Carolina with an equal amount of benefits for the amount of taxes that it's paying, then the South Carolina will just simply refuse to enforce the payment of federal taxes. Okay. When Andrew Jackson hears about this argument, he hits the roof. Andrew Jackson is legendary for his temper, especially when it comes to the idea that the existence of the federal union is being threatened. And Jackson just sort of immediately loses all sense of calm about how this issue is going to happen or how this is going to get resolved. Jackson goes to Congress and begins to ask for more tools on how to fix the situation. How can the president lead the federal government in such a way that the federal government comes out victorious in this particular situation? South Carolina has already passed a resolution called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest that's authored by Jackson's own vice president, John C. Calhoun, in which they declare that if the federal government does not withdraw the demand for tax payment by February 1st, 1833, then the state of South Carolina will not enforce it. And if the federal government insists that South Carolina enforce it, then South Carolina will actually secede from the Union. Now, our next speaker is going to talk a little more about secession, so we will get there then. Let me go ahead and share with you the force bill. This is what I want to, this is the document I want to share with you next. Okay. Sorry, folks, I was just having just a little bit of a tech issue there, but I think we've got that taken care of. Okay. So this is from the Library of Congress's, or I'm sorry, Teaching American History website. And what you are looking at here is a transcription of the force bill, as it was called. Andrew Jackson had set up such a strong position in relation to South Carolina and the federal government, the position of the federal government in relation to South Carolina. He begins threatening things like military action. If South Carolina does not back off of this, then Jackson will make sure that federal taxes are paid. And if he has to send the military in to make that happen, that's what he will do. Okay, so he's been threatening this already. South Carolina is asking for help. The federal government is not really negotiating with them how to change the taxes. And so it all kind of ends up in this spot where Jackson doesn't want to back down. I think it would have embarrassed him to back down at this point. He can't back down. He's got to show strength. And yet at the same time, South Carolina is on the verge of leaving the country over this very issue. So the force bill gets passed. They also renegotiate the tax rate with South Carolina, which gives them a gradual reduction in the tax over time. And so everybody emerges from this moment of rebellion feeling a little bit more confident in their own position. But the reason I like to look at the force bill is that this becomes a very powerful tool, not just for Jackson personally, but for the office of the presidency. Because the document you're looking here, just in this first sentence, it says, it gives you the intention of this document, that whenever, by reason of unlawful obstruction, combination, or assemblage of persons, it shall become impractical in the judgment of the president to execute the revenue laws and collect the duties on imports in the ordinary way in any collection district, it shall and may be lawful for the president to direct that the custom house for such district be established and kept in any secure place. And once again, would not have won any writing awards, but the idea is the same, that there is a duty of the president to enforce the laws of the country, that the president has a role in the enforcement of legislation, and that in this case, it specifically applies to taxes and the national revenue. This idea, though, that the president can enforce certain things is something that's going to grow with the presidency over time. And so this becomes not just a tool for Jackson, but a tool that presidents have in their toolbox, if you want to think of it that way, ever afterwards, as they're trying to secure moments of rebellion in the nation. So let me go ahead and stop there. We'll yield to the gentleman from Illinois, and we will get to those questions here a little bit more thoroughly in just a moment. But in the meantime, I will follow my colleague's example from Mount Vernon. How would you have dealt with a whole state that's willing to break the nation apart because it doesn't want to pay its taxes? What are you thinking? Go ahead and throw that in the chat. We'll talk about it. All right, Mr. McWhorter, Dr. McWhorter, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, and you know, I hope you're all seeing a lot of things, a lot of elements of these crises are being repeated. In some ways, they're getting bigger, right? We started with a little local rebellion, we spread to a whole state. By the time we get to Lincoln dealing with crisis, we're dealing with multiple states are in a state of rebellion and trying to break apart the Union. And, you know, the thread you're probably seeing through all these is questions that Americans had, especially in the first century of the United States existence, although we still argue about these things now, questions that Americans had about local state control, or even smaller than that, local control versus the power of the federal government. And where does authority ultimately lie in a democracy? And at what point does local control or state control go too far that it breaks democracy, right? Washington and Jackson are both reacting to their respective crises because they feel that if they don't, they'll establish a precedent that will break the whole country, right? These are the questions that Lincoln is also juggling during his presidency. So the Civil War, as you may know, begins in 1861. And you've probably heard that the Civil War was about slavery. And that's correct. The Civil War was fought over the future of the institution of slavery. But Americans had been arguing about the institution of slavery really since the founding, and especially in the 1850s, the decade preceding the Civil War. And so so then why didn't the war break out sooner, right? Or why didn't it happen some other time? Why wasn't there a civil war over slavery? Well, that's because there's a specific constitutional crisis that occurs during the Civil War that turns the debate over slavery, which had been raging since the 1850s, is a key component of the nullification crisis that you just heard about, that turns that argument into a rebellion, which is what we're talking about today. And then Lincoln goes from being a politician who's debating the future of slavery in America to an active participant in suppressing a rebellion. So we'll talk a little bit about that. That decade before the Civil War, the 1850s that I mentioned, just to set the table, that's when slavery really emerges as the dominant national subject of debate in the United States. It had always been controversial since at least since the American Revolution. When after the American Revolution, most of the northern states make slavery illegal. But during the 1850s, and I won't go into the details, but another common thread you probably noticed in all these crises is westward expansion. As America acquires more territory westward, these questions about state and local control and about slavery bubble up, and then they'll create a crisis. In the late 1840s, the United States acquired an enormous amount of territory west of the Mississippi River. And the 1850s are dominated by political debates over whether slavery should be allowed to spread westward into these new states or whether they should be free states. The Republican Party, which Lincoln is the second presidential candidate and the first presidential candidate to win, one of the key components of the Republican Party platform is to prevent the institution of slavery from spreading westward. They are the party of not letting slavery spread westward. The Democratic Party is in favor of other means that might allow slavery to expand further westward. And that's what dominates the election of 1860, which is when Lincoln runs for president. And Lincoln ends up winning that election. He doesn't win a single vote in the southern states where slavery is strongest. But he carries the North, and that's enough to win the presidency. The Democratic Party actually splits into two candidates, again, over the slavery issue. And over the course of Lincoln's political career and the rise of the Republican Party, white Southerners, black Southerners, of course, couldn't vote. White Southerners, and were mostly enslaved, white Southerners decide that the Republican Party doesn't just want slavery to stop expanding westward. They want slavery to be destroyed altogether. And so they see Lincoln's election as a fundamental threat to the institution of slavery, which they are determined to protect. And so, today, when a president gets elected, they get elected in November, and then a few months go by before they take office, right? Well, that was true back then as well. So Lincoln gets elected in November of 1860. He won't take office until March of 1861. But even before Lincoln's first day in office, the deep, states in the South, slaveholding states, led by South Carolina, again, we got South Carolina again, begin to secede. And secede is just a fancy word for separate. What they argue, what pro-slavery advocates in the South and other white Southerners argue, is that it is constitutionally legal for any state in the Union to break away if they decide their interests are no longer being met by being part of the United States. And so they begin to do this after Lincoln gets elected. About a month after his election, they start to secede, and then they join together and form the Confederate States of America. Now, again, the reason they're doing this is to protect slavery. But the actual constitutional crisis here that enables Abraham Lincoln to raise troops and that results in a war is this idea of secession, because Lincoln and others believe that secession is unconstitutional. And so therefore, if you claim yourself independent from the United States and then you take up arms against the United States, you're acting in rebellion. This is a rebellion. This isn't a legal constitutional thing. This is a rebellion. And so that's what empowers Lincoln through the force bill that we just mentioned. Also, Lincoln believes his constitutional authority as commander-in-chief to fight and forcibly bring the South back into the Union. And that's why you'll often hear the Civil War, right? When we talk about the Civil War, you'll often hear it said that one side is the Confederacy, right? That's the South, and the other side's the Union. Well, the Union, that's a bit misleading, because the Union is just the United States, right? The Union Army is the United States Army. But sometimes we call them the Union because that's what the North is fighting for, right? The North is fighting to keep the country together. So that's the specific constitutional issue that creates the Civil War. And that's what when Lincoln finally takes office on March 4th, 1861, and he gives his first inaugural address, and you can go ahead and throw that up, Heather. I think Heather has an image of it. A lot of what that speech is about is that Lincoln is arguing that that secession is illegal, that not only is secession illegal, but it's unnecessary. And he's not just arguing this on constitutional grounds. He's also arguing that secession, the whole idea, would destroy American democracy. And he does that most clearly in the paragraph that we've highlighted here for you. This is Lincoln's draft of it. You can see that it's got his handwriting, but it also has other pieces pasted in. I'm going to read this paragraph to you. My two colleagues both talked about how their presidents aren't going to win any writing awards. I'm lucky I get to work with Lincoln, who is probably the best writer we ever had as president. So here's what Lincoln says in the middle of this, of his first inaugural address. He says, plainly, the central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy. A majority held in restraint by constitutional checks and limitations, and always changing easily with deliberate changes of popular opinion and sentiments, is the only true sovereign of a free people. So what Lincoln is saying is, the only way you can have a free democratic people is if you have elections, if people are allowed to vote, but you can change these things easily, right? That's how people govern themselves, right? That's how you have a democracy, a majority that's held in check and that you can easily change laws and things like that. Whoever rejects it does, of necessity, fly to anarchy or to despotism, right? Anarchy means no government at all, right? Despotism means, like dictatorship, ruled by one person. Unanimity is impossible. The rule of a minority as a permanent arrangement is wholly inadmissible. So that rejecting the majority principle, anarchy or despotism in some form, is all that is left. So what Lincoln's saying is, if you allow secession, or even nullification that we just talked about, right? If you allow secession or nullification, what you're allowing is a minority to dictate how the government works and dictate what the government can do. And that breaks democracy, right? That it would eventually just lead to chaos and anarchy, and eventually someone would come in and take over everything through despotism. So that's the kind of main principle that Lincoln is fighting against in the Civil War, is secession couldn't be, not only is it unconstitutional based on reading the Constitution, it would break the United States if we allowed this thing. But then what about slavery, right? We were talking about slavery. I started by talking about slavery. Where's slavery in all this, right? Well, Lincoln knows, and so do most people, that this issue of whether a state can secede, the reason they're considering seceding is because they want to protect the issue of, or the institution of slavery. And as I mentioned earlier, Republicans are arguing in 1861, all they want to do is keep slavery from expanding westward. And that's true, but a lot of them also would gladly see the institution go away, right? And one of the reasons they don't want it to expand westward is because they think if they keep it in the South, it'll die out on its own. And as the war goes on, there's increasing pressure on the Lincoln administration, on the US military, a lot of it coming from African Americans themselves, to make slavery part of their war aim. That the aim should not just be to restore the Union, but it should also be to destroy slavery, not only because slavery is wrong, but because slavery caused this crisis in the first place. So if you want to keep this from ever happening again, right, you have to get rid of slavery. The new Union that you create has to be one where there's no longer this captive, force of people forced to labor for other people. And eventually that makes its way up to the halls of power. And that's where you get the Emancipation Proclamation from, which I'm sure you've all heard of. That goes into effect on January 1st, 1863. That frees all enslaved people in those territories under rebellion, the parts of the United States under the Confederacy. And then by the time Lincoln gets reelected in 1864, the 13th Amendment has passed the Senate, and it will soon after pass the House of Representatives. And the 13th Amendment is the part of the Constitution that permanently makes slavery illegal everywhere. So those two things happen as the war goes on. As the war goes on, slavery increasingly becomes part of what the North is fighting for in the Civil War. And so, going back to the two previous speakers, right, you have these, the challenge is, can a state secede from the Union legally, right? But the resolution to that is Lincoln is able to restore the Union, but as a result of doing that, slavery also is destroyed. And the best authority on that interpretation of the Civil War is Lincoln himself. 4 years after that first inaugural address I read to you, he gives his second inaugural address, which is considered, alongside the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln's greatest speech. And so I'm going to read a section of that to you now, where Lincoln defines, he goes back to that first inaugural and what was happening, and then he defines what the war was really about after 4 years of bloody struggle, right? On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. So he's saying, when he was giving his first inaugural address, because the war hadn't started yet, the war starts a month later, he and his people are trying to save the Union without war, right, by persuading the South back into the Union. And Southerners are trying to break up the Union without war by working as insurgents to try to break the Union apart. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive. That's the Confederates. And the other would accept war rather than let it perish. That's the Union. And the war came, right? So that was the problem. The South wanted independence and they were willing to fight for it. And the North was willing to keep the nation together and they were willing to fight for that. But then look at the transition he makes. He makes a transition here, something he didn't do 4 years before, to talking explicitly about slavery. Lincoln says 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war, right? So Lincoln is saying the war was about slavery. We all knew it too. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents, again, the Confederates, would rend the Union, right? They would destroy the country, even by war. Well, the government, that's the North, that's Lincoln, claimed no right to do more than restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict, slavery, might cease with or even before the conflict itself should cease. So the idea that slavery would be affected by the war was something neither side was thinking about either. The war itself wouldn't involve that. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and prayed to the same God, and each invoked his aid against the other. And then he really goes in on slavery here. It may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us not judge that we be not judged. So he's saying to the Confederacy, it seems strange that you would invoke God on your side when what you do is you force other people to do your work for you. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. I'll stop there because I want some Q&A, but basically what Lincoln goes on to say in his second inaugural address, and I encourage you all to read it, is he speculates that the war itself is actually a punishment from God. And Lincoln was not, Lincoln's religion was a little shaky. He was never a member of any church, so it's kind of bold for him to say this, that he believes that the Civil War itself and the suffering it caused was actually God punishing the United States for the sin of slavery. For all of the years it spent using enslaved people, and he specifically talks about the lash and from whipping and hurting enslaved people, that the Civil War was punishment for that from God himself. So you can see then, right, this is how much slavery has now become part of Lincoln's thinking, has become part of what the United States is trying to achieve by putting down the Confederacy. So I really want to emphasize, and then we'll do questions. I just want to end on that note that, you know, like all these other crises we talked before, there's a specific kind of legal, you know, fight going on in all three of these cases. In this case, it's the right to secession, but there's these broader issues that are part of it as well. And in the case of the Civil War, that broader issue, the perpetuation of slavery, eventually bubbles up and becomes a key component of that rebellion, and then becomes part of, when you defeat that rebellion, slavery then goes away with it, and that's how slavery is defeated in the United States. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to answering your questions.
So we've got a couple. I think I'm going to do one for each president. But first, thank you all so much for the wonderful presentations. Totally wonderful to hear. We had lots of good questions. So Allison, let's talk about Washington. There were two questions. I want to try and merge them. So the first one I think is pretty straightforward. Does the proclamation that he issued have the same weight as an executive order? Because that's more what we hear today. So how would you compare those two?
Yeah, so I'm not a legal scholar, so take what I have from historical perspective, but an executive order is enforced by legislation. Like it can be, you know, like the Supreme Court can weigh in on an executive order. As we see, a proclamation, with the way we think about it today, is a lot more celebratory. Like I'm going to proclaim something, it's not necessarily enforceable. And if you look at the lines of the proclamation that I read, it's very specific about how Washington is responding to this crisis, but it doesn't lay down any new laws or any new policies. It just says that this is too much and this is how I'm going to respond. The response is already built into the Constitution. So a proclamation, even though it's seen as sort of less heavy-handed, has done a lot of heavy-handed work in history like it does here.
Perfect. And then the second Washington question, the student wants to know if you felt like, for lack of a better expression, so he talked about George Washington being revered and respected. So I'm going to call that celebrity. Do you think George Washington's celebrity had any, and the fact that he was leading the troops had anything to do with halting the rebellion? Or do we see evidence of that in the historical records?
I think maybe less celebrity and more graveness, like that it was this serious. You know, Washington was the military leader who fought the British, and that like this was egregious enough that he would step up and lead that military again, right? So it really laid weight to it as opposed to sort of like name recognition, that Washington was a part of moving these troops. Yes.
Perfect. So Aaron, with Jackson, someone in the chat asked if Jackson and Congress were of the same political party. But I think the bigger question here is, how did Congress respond to what Jackson was doing? Like, I think the political party is a piece of it, but I think the bigger question is, what did that relationship look like?
So one of my favorite things about Jackson and his relationship with Congress, both terms that he has, he's elected by a significant margin. So you really can interpret a lot of Jackson's actions as a mandate from the people, right? Because he is elected by these significant margins. Congress is the one who passes the force bill. So Jackson has, it's not a proclamation. He makes a proclamation to the people of South Carolina, essentially saying, you people need to get your act together, and here's what I'm going to do about it if you don't. But there's no additional sort of legal weight. It's not an executive order, right? He's not actually marching troops into South Carolina. So it takes Congress to pass the force bill, and this becomes So he has a Congress that's very much in his favor and in his camp. But the Speaker of the House of Representatives, of course, is Henry Clay, who's one of Jackson's great arch enemies. But it takes the genius of Henry Clay, the great compromiser, to hammer out this detail. And he is willing, even as Jackson's kind of arch enemy, along with John C. Calhoun, he's willing to let Jackson have the force bill in exchange for reducing the tariff on South Carolina and then extinguishing the fire of this rebellion that's happening. So it takes Congress to do it. Jackson doesn't just make up the force bill and say, here's what we're going to do about it. And so I love how the force bill keeps reiterating that the president is authorized, the president has, may or shall act in this way, because it's essentially Congress's way of saying, hey, president, we give you authority to enforce some of these laws and actions as well. That isn't just Congress that enforces them, or the judicial branch, it's also the executive branch that has the right to enforce law.
So Christian, we have a question that I think is probably best with you because you're a Lincoln historian. So in the United States, why did slavery last so much longer than it did in other regions around the world, particularly considering how devastating it was on the Black population?
I mean, that's a hard question to answer. I mean, but there's a few things. I mean, one is when the founders, create the Union, they could have dealt with it then, and they chose not to. It's no coincidence that most of the presidents leading up to Lincoln, including the other two we talked about today, were slaveholders themselves. And so, and they don't really, the Constitution takes kind of some baby steps by limiting the slave trade itself, but it doesn't really create a mechanism for getting rid of the institution of slavery. So that's partly part of it. And then subsequent politicians in American history are complicit in that as well. There's a gag rule imposed where Congress really isn't allowed to even share petitions that have to do with slavery. So that's why it takes, to come back to where I started from, that's why it takes westward expansion to kind of break it, because then that argument over whether new states will be slave or free is really what boils it up to the top. Because if you have more of one or the other, right, then you'll have a majority in the Senate, because every state gets 2 senators, right? And so that's really where, what breaks that logjam. But then you need a war. And nevertheless, you still need a war, a really brutal war, to get rid of slavery in the United States. I'll throw in one more thing that just from the previous 2 questions too that I want to mention. Since we're talking about rebellion here, there were questions about, we danced around this issue of what a proclamation is. All of these presidents, the Constitution empowers a president to maintain the Union. It's one of the president's key duties. And so what Lincoln especially is doing, but Jackson and Washington are doing too, that's where they're getting the power to issue these proclamations from. One of the points, Lincoln gets criticized a lot for the Emancipation Proclamation, that it didn't do more. One of the things to remember about the Emancipation Proclamation, one of the ironies of the Civil War, is the only reason Lincoln can do it at all is because he's putting down a rebellion, right? The irony of the Civil War is that the South never secedes, Lincoln doesn't get to attack slavery. And so that's one thing to remember. These proclamations are war acts that these presidents are taking because rebellions are happening. So be careful when you wage a rebellion. Sometimes you might get the opposite of what you're looking for.
Okay, and one last question, which I think we have time for, but it's going to have to be fast. So we know Lincoln was assassinated within days of the Civil War ending. And so how much do we know about what his plans were for bringing the South back into the Union? Obviously it was Johnson that oversaw Reconstruction, but what do we actually know about Lincoln's thoughts on that?
Yeah, one thing to remember about that second inaugural address is Lincoln, only a little over a month after he gives that speech, Lincoln is assassinated. So we don't really get to see what Lincoln would have done after the Civil War. And we have some glimpses. He certainly wanted to go easy on the white Southerners who had rebelled against the Union. He could have been extremely harsh with them. Technically, they were all traitors because they had gone against the Constitution and rebelled against their government. And he didn't want them all to be treated that way. But he's also very concerned about African Americans and what will their role be in the United States. And I think Lincoln's opinion on that changes over time. And we don't know where he would have landed. We don't know whether Lincoln would have eventually landed on complete civil equality between white and black people. But in the very last speech he ever gives on April 11th, so 3 days before Booth assassinates him, Lincoln proposes giving at least some black men the right to vote. And this is a pretty radical thing to propose. No president had ever proposed giving black people the right to vote before. And actually Booth witnesses that speech. And it's because Booth hears Lincoln say that he changes his plan from kidnapping Lincoln to murdering him, because he's so upset by the idea of living in a country where black people could vote. So those just give us glimpses as to what Lincoln might have done, but unfortunately we really don't know.
All right, well, I'm going to stop asking questions. We are officially on the hour. So thank you all so much for your great answers and the great questions too. Casey, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much to all of our presenters for all of your time and expertise with this really excellent program. And thanks so much to everyone who attended today and participated. It's been a really great turnout and I'm really glad we are all here. So I hope to see you all at future PPSP programs and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.